This is Michael Jacobides, professor at the London Business School and lead advisor of Evolution Limited, speaking to you about how to compete in a world of ecosystems. But what's it all about, these ecosystems? Ever since we realized that the world's most valuable firms have ceased just being the biggest industrial conglomerates, oil companies or banks of the West or of the East, and that it is the biggest companies that use platforms and ecosystems to dominate, people started really looking at this new phenomenon. What is it? Well, let's take one of the big techs to understand how these ecosystems are structured. Ecosystems provide bundles of products and services that make your life simple. Think about what Google is doing. It is providing everything from search to music to fitness to maps and gives it to you in a package that just makes your daily life simpler. So in a way, it gives you a bundle, and it is this bundle that firms are competing in, trying to find new ways of making us customers or even corporate customers happy. But in addition to these multi-actor, these broad ecosystems that provide value, you have groups of collaborating firms that come together, and within each of these verticals, you see that organizations are able to leverage the energy of small firms. Google doesn't write its own apps, but it does set the perimeters of who's in and who isn't, of how you will govern the ecosystem of collaborating firms that are going to come together to add value. And this isn't just tech. You think about how ecosystems emerge in areas such as commerce or technology, like Reliance Jio in India, or retail like Rakuten in Japan, that from the retail area is moving into being the first 5G producer in its country. Or even the erstwhile most profitable bank in Europe, Sber, that decided that it is boring to be a bank, and the way that it was trying to revolutionize banking is to move away from its traditional remit to become a broad ecosystem that on the one hand covered lots and lots of areas, and on the other hand leveraged the connection with many of these complementers. So what should you do? Well, the temptation might be to say, I'm going to do what the big companies are doing, and I'm going to be successful. Which brings me to the Greek freak fallacy. What's the story? Well, Giannis Antetokounmpo, a remarkable basketball player, there's a Netflix out on him that you can watch, is someone who can shoot baskets from 7 meters. Now, the problem is that quite often what we see as advice is taking some very unusual and very strong firms and then telling organizations to simply emulate success that way. And it doesn't work, because it's not that your 7-year-old son will be better off starting to shoot from 7 meters. It needs to take Giannis Antetokounmpo to shoot baskets from 7 meters rather than the other way around. So what we have done with this paper, and technically speaking, I guess, what I have done with this paper is to develop a framework that helps you not simply say, I'm going to emulate all the big and powerful firms, but walk you through the kinds of steps that you need to take in order to be successful in the world of ecosystems. And this is unusual in terms of my own experience as a professor, because it doesn't only draw on research, on looking at facts rigorously. We do that too. But it also relates to projects that have happened with some of the world's big firms in Asia, in Europe, and a bit in the United States, trying to think about how they should shape their ecosystem strategy and what they can do to succeed. And I also mentioned we, and the reason is that in addition to me as the lead author, there's been a terrific team of collaborators working in Evolution Limited for some of these projects for the firms that gave us not only the evidence, but the opportunity of understanding what the issues are and being able to take the facts and put them in a way that will hopefully be useful for you. So what is it that we say? Well, that fundamentally, if you think about being successful in ecosystems, rather than emulating these atypical firms, you should start by asking the first question, which is, why would you bother anyway? Surprisingly, it is not a question that people engaged in ecosystems ask, because they sometimes jump into the what. What is it that I want to do? What is my position in the ecosystem? Or even more so, the how, the tactics, the collaboration in specific platforms that people do blindly, thinking that this is the trendy thing to do. Let's see what emerges when you start asking these big questions and try to figure out how you can create some guidance for deciding what your ecosystem play should be. Our thought, our findings, is that you can have a framework that helps you both define where you compete and also helps you build a multi-party ecosystem. The first is about the multi-product, the experience ecosystem that you can build. What do I mean by that? Well, consider, for instance, what Nike is doing. Nike is not longer only selling shoes or sportswear. It is trying to cover broader sets of needs in order to ensure that people who run, people who exercise, can find gratification, but also find community, connect to other devices, to the wearables, not only those that it produced a line of work that it tried to engage in, but realized it's not going to be as effective for it, but also curate and support different communities, both in the real world and even in the metaverse. They just paid $65 million in order to buy a company that, blows the mind, designs the footwear for your virtual avatar. But that takes a lot of investment. Can companies that do not have the marketing budget and the desire to impress with their fancy purchases also do it? I think that the answer is yes. We recently worked with Lavazza, that has realized that it should not only focus on making coffee. It should think about the broader experience and think about how it can create ecosystems to support it. How do you do it? Our framework suggests that there are two ways. The first is that you think about the anchors, the things that you have that can be leveraged, that can attract your complementers. Take, for instance, NL. Working with NL, we realize that they've got things that go beyond the traditional services. And sure, NL is a traditional energy utility, but that means that it has, for instance, 3 million lampposts. And these lampposts could be anchors, could be the things that could be the basis for it expanding its value proposition. And if it thought of itself as a B to G to V, business to government to voters, think about what is going to add value to those final constituents. Think about how it can expand that to offer Wi-Fi, architectural lighting, bus network information, and try to think about both broadening the scope and broadening the set of complementers that are going to come with it. You then start mapping the different opportunities that customers have, and you realize that the map of ecosystem competition is becoming ever more interesting, and of course with it the tactics change. It's different to say I'm going to set up my new ecosystem the way that Apple did with its original iOS, or Nespresso did when there was no other ecosystem in coffee, and it's different if you say, in the presence of these other ecosystems, what do I do? Do I go head on? Do I try to focus on a narrower sliver in order to help offer it a better service? Or do I do the opposite? Do I do what many of these super apps are trying to do, offering a broad swathe of activities? Understanding what you're after will help you figure out which strategy is right for you. And once you've understood the broader scope, then you realize that there may be some areas that you weren't involved before and that you now should be. And for these areas, you may realize that you're not going to go it alone. And that's where we go to the second part of our framework. It is where you think about the flywheel, about the multi-actor ecosystem that helps you understand what is your role, what is your double value proposition vis-a-vis not only the customers, but also your complementers. How do you manage the partnering process, whether you run the show or not? And also, how do you shape the ecosystem governance, and how do you identify both the business case so that you know that you are getting something for your effort and that you are translating it into KPIs that the organization is going to care about? That means that you have thought through the basic roles that ecosystems offer. And these are being an orchestrator, this entity that manages the ecosystem, that defines the rules, the norms of engagement, that puts in the considerable capital, but on the other hand is able to dictate terms and also have a very important role in the distribution of value. And I'd say that more companies than they should want to be the orchestrators of the ecosystems, whereas are terrific opportunities not to orchestrate because you really need to be extraordinarily either endowed or gifted to do that, but to become a partner and think about how you're going to improve your position by becoming an active participant in these ecosystems or just a complementer in others. And it's important to remember that one ecosystem is not your ecosystem strategy, and you will create a portfolio. So think flexibly about what your role is. But even after you have defined your role, you need to think also carefully about what your value proposition is, not only to the final customer, but also to the other members of the ecosystem, and the financial and non-financial inducements that you have in order to excite them. And that's where I think a great misunderstanding happens between ecosystems and egosystems, as many of the companies that we've seen failed because they just assumed that not only customers, but also the complementers, perhaps sometimes their orchestrators or partners, would flock. The point here is choice, and that's exactly what you need to manage to do. And then you will come to some proposal of what your ecosystem portfolio is going to be. But even after you do that, even after you know both the value proposition and the way that you will connect with your complementers, you need to make sure that this is dynamic and this works in practice. And we have seen that some of the companies that have pioneered in the ecosystem practice, like Haier, the Chinese appliance manufacturer, and its American counterpart, GE Appliances, that are trying to fight for the smart kitchen hub and to manage your interactions, are not only looking at the KPIs, but they are restructuring their entire organizations. When I was in Qingdao looking at the elevators in the higher building, I saw a picture of rocket ships and submarines, and I asked my Chinese translator, what were these? They told me that these were the ecosystem micro-enterprise communities, the entities through which organization works in the higher universe, and they are the ones that have the highest and the lowest ecosystem revenues, because Zhang Ruimin, the CEO, understands that their ability of winning in this world is going to be what's going to drive the difference between success and failure. So, what does this article show you? It provides a concrete framework, sets of steps that you can follow in order to be successful. This leads to the detailed guidance that has underpinned the work that we have done, looking at how we can help organizations ask the right questions in order to get to the right answers. And it is part of the thought leadership that you can see in the Evolution Limited site that expands from ecosystems overall to some of the hot new tools, like thinking about gamification, what works and what doesn't, or thinking about building the experience ecosystems for FMCGs, or thinking about particular verticals like ecosystems and platforms in healthcare, and the other hot area, which is to understand how the issues of regulation and policy combine with technology to drive two things. The first is the possibility that you have to capture value, and the second is the regulatory challenges that are right now shaping our world. Because we are now in a world whereby regulation, for the first time, will redefine how labor is organized and who's going to be able to make money in the ecosystems of the future. But to give you a guide in this shifting context, I hope that you will find this paper interesting. We'd be delighted to hear your views.